incredible place. This is the kind of condition the Apostle Paul may well have been subjected to when he wrote, "Rejoice always," and again I say rejoice. But it was in that kind of a setting that the Apostle Paul really was coming to the end of his line. I mean, he'd lived all the glory years, the great adventures through the expansion of the church in Asia Minor and into Greece, and the wonder of preaching in Athens on Mars Hill, the great accomplishments in Corinth, and the blessedness of Thessalonica, the tremendous joy of the Bereans who searched the Scriptures, all of the adventures of going back to Jerusalem and traveling again across the Mediterranean, the shipwreck, the victories, and all of the things that came into his life. This man is summing up a great life, but he's pretty well on the shelf. You know, he's really the spiritual father, grandfather, or uncle of everybody who was saved in the Gentile world. He was the key. He was founding churches in his own country before he ever was called to be a pastor at Antioch, and from there sent on his missionary tours. I mean, he had a tremendous influence, like no man who lived at that time in the Gentile world. He was everybody's hero. In fact, when he came to preach a sermon, he could preach all night if he wanted, and they loved it. A guy would fall out of the window and die. They'd just go downstairs, raise him from the dead, go back up, and preach the rest of the sermon. I reminded somebody that one time, that Paul preached all night. Even when people, died, he kept on preaching. And they said to me, well, when you can raise them from the dead, you can keep going too. But anyway, Paul was so beloved by everybody that they listened. And when Paul came to town, they embraced him. When he left town, Acts 20, the Ephesian elders fell all over his neck and kissed him and wept all over him because they wouldn't see his face anymore, and they loved him so much. Now, I'll tell you something. Living in the world of that kind of acceptance and living in the world of that kind of affection, living under that kind of love would be a tremendous experience, wouldn't it? Tremendous. To be so beloved, to be so accepted, to have everybody doting on you and sending you love gifts, such as even the Philippians sent him. Oh, he was beloved. But you know what was happening? He was getting on the shelf now. And a new breed of young preachers was coming behind him. And man, they were capturing the fancy of the people. And they had little nuances and new ways. They had learned all the best of what Paul had and maybe advanced a little bit in technique. And they were the sharpshooters of the new era. And they were moving in behind Paul. And now Paul's a prisoner. He can't move. He's lost his mobility. And these guys are attracting the attention of the crowds. And the people are beginning to dote on them. And they've forgotten those old fellas that have passed along, the apostles and Paul. And those are memories. I often meet an old man like that. I remember meeting a dear old man of God in the Midwest, and he was 96. He hadn't been able to preach for about 15 years, but he preached from the time he was 20 till he was about 81. And he sat in the congregation. He listened to me preach with his old Bible, and he kind of shook, and his teeth didn't work too well. They clicked a lot, but I don't know whether they chewed very good. And nobody even knew who he was, and he was very obscure in an old black suit and a string tie, and he had to wonder about all the glory days and all the great years when he was a shining sword in the usefulness of the Lord. Well, Paul was kind of in the shelf kind of time of his life, and it wouldn't be long before he'd lay his head on a block and an axe head would flash in the sun and sever it from his body, and it'd be over for him in this world. And along behind him were coming these young men. And as young men are prone to do, to find their own place in the sun, they invariably criticize the generation ahead of them. Well, those old boys didn't really have it. They weren't up. They weren't with it. And they were saying things like, well, you see, Paul's a prisoner because, the Lord just kind of gently shelved him. I mean, he wasn't contemporary. He may have blown it in his life. We don't know all the things that went on. There's a reason the Lord stuck him away like that. And so Paul says concerning them in verse 14, and many of the brethren in the Lord, becoming confident by my bonds, are much more bold to speak the word without fear. Some people, now that they see I'm a prisoner, they've become more bold. They're saying if Paul can be a prisoner for Christ, so can we. He's our model. He's our example. In other words, some are still following me. Some still believe in me. And boy, they're becoming bold, even though I'm a prisoner. But some, verse 15, preach Christ of envy and strife. What do you mean, Paul? Well, some are out there preaching Christ, but it's out of envy In other words, they're envious of what God has done in my life. They're envious of my reputation. They're envious of my place in the church. They're envious of the love that I have. And so they create strife in the body over their envy. Verse 16, they preach Christ contentiously, not sincerely. They want to add affliction to my bonds. It's not enough that I'm a prisoner, but they're taking shots at me and they're double hurting me. Can you imagine that? Can you imagine young men coming along taking shots at the Apostle Paul? I can. It's easy for a young man. It's easy to think the sun rises and sets on you. And the old generation have faded away. What do they know? That's why God lifts up the hoary heads. That's why God talks about elders, because there is something they know that young men need well to learn. They don't have all the answers. The longer I live, the fewer answers I am sure about, and the more I look to the wisdom of the old. But they were preaching Christ and knocking Paul. But what's his attitude? I love this. Verse 18. So what? Notwithstanding, every way, I don't care how they preach, whether it's pretense or truth, Christ is preached. And in that I do rejoice, yea, and will rejoice. In other words, what Paul is saying, look, if Christ is preached, who cares what they say about me? Isn't that great? I'll tell you something, people. That is a level of spiritual maturity. When you confess Jesus as Lord, that's the beginning. When you bend to His Lordship to the point where you are content to give Him glory no matter what it costs, when you begin to feel the things that dishonor Him, and when you don't mind being dishonored if He is honored, you are aiming your life at His glory. And you are moving toward maturity. Now, this is where it has to begin, with a life of obedient submission to Christ. Could I invite you to look with me at 1 Peter for a moment? And maybe we can sum this up in 1 Peter 4 and verse 14. 1 Peter 4 and verse 14. Just listen to this great thought. And remember that Peter is writing to some believers who are really going through it. I mean, they are being persecuted. They are being tried for their faith. It is tough to endure what they're enduring. They are suffering. They are being confronted by people who want to know answers about what they believe. Verse 14. If you be reproached for the name of Christ, blessed are you, happy are you. Now wait a minute. Most Christians wouldn't experience that happiness. Most people, if they're reproached, even for the name of Christ, get angry, get reactionary, retaliatory, vengeful. You can't do that to me. I've seen people on the job be reproached for the name of Christ. I've seen athletes on professional teams be reproached for the name of Christ. I've had people mock me for the name of Christ. Can I say, I'm happy? I'm happy. Well, that's what Peter said. You should be happy. That's a special blessing. That means Christ is visible enough for you to be reproached for Him. Look what he said. For the Spirit of glory and of God rests on you. In other words, if you are so living your life in obedience to His will that the world can't tolerate that kind of living,